Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Solidarity Live. Today we have a very special episode with you. We're going to be discussing marijuana and drug reform with Justin Strekal, Political Director of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana, or NORML. Hi, Justin.
Hey, Jocelyn. Great to be here and excited
Great to
to talk about
see
cannabis.
you. Also, on a personal note, Justin is a very good friend of mine. So I'm going to try to keep it professional, but not necessarily any promises. Well, sorry, Justin.
No worries. And in my day job of being a federal lobbyist, I'm very good at code switching. So I will try to keep it 100 here and be as forward as possible about the policy.
Are we calling you a lobbyist now? That feels like a dirty word for the very good justice-oriented work you're doing on Capitol Hill.
Well, I am a registered federal lobbyist. I often like to joke that I'm a lobbyist who believes in the abolition of lobbying. But no, yeah. So I am a registered federal lobbyist, and I spend a bulk of my time trying to figure out how to move members of Congress from up and down the scale, from prohibitionist to supporter of ending marijuana criminalization and supporting the record expungement and access to ownership for people other than well-capitalized Wall Street managers.
Well, so I have a ton that we're going to try to fit into this show because there is a lot of policy I want to ask you about, because this is an issue that I think people feel very passionately about, increasingly so, because at this point, I think it's a pretty well-regarded fact that marijuana is not a violent substance and people should not be going to jail at all for using what is a pretty ubiquitous social substance. But before we get into the details of that, what is this process like for you? Like when you go and you're speaking with a member, like how do you bring them around to this? Because you've been doing this for 5-6 years now.
Yeah, no, coming up on 5 years. In my previous life, I worked on political campaigns for about a decade, and that actually really helped me refine the skill set that I apply every day when I'm lobbying for marijuana policy reform, because I think we as advocates for whatever cause it is, be it marijuana policy reform or campaign finance reform or expanding Social Security or whatever it may be that you're pushing, we so often prioritize our, demonstrating that we know what we're talking about and that we sound good and that we're espousing why we care about things. And we often forget that we need to meet people where they are, and that getting them from where they are to where we want them to be is not just an A to B, but it's an A to triple Z. And we need to move them up that ladder of engagement. And for some people, one interaction, maybe we can move them from A to B. For some people, maybe we'll move them from A to J in just one interaction. But we really gotta, a lot of my job is asking questions to understand where the office is, how the member of Congress thinks, what are the things that influence that member of Congress, and move forward accordingly, providing them the kind of arguments or data or justifications that would help them move as quickly as possible to supporting an end to the criminalization of cannabis.
Well, do you have any stories for us? Is there anybody that's been moved significantly over the past 5 years? Because I feel like you've been political director of NORML for a very volatile period with all of this in a good way.
Yeah. No, I mean, well, I accepted the job in October of 2016 when the smart money said that Hillary Clinton was about to become the next president, and it was a lot of my thinking in that initial month was, okay, how is it that I'm going to be able to approach the administration and move Hillary Clinton forward? Because she wasn't necessarily, she had a bad record on it, but she hadn't had an entrenched negative position on it. And then obviously Donald Trump was elected. So that's very different. But I'll share a story. I'm not going to name names here, but
wait, why not? Why not? Why aren't you going to name names?
because they're still in Congress. There was a Republican member of Congress who I spoke with, just outside the Capitol in the House Triangle, and I introduced myself. We started talking. I mentioned NORML, and they asked me, what's his name? is Keith still around? And Keith is the founder of NORML, who used to be a Senate staffer in 1970, and furious about the war in Vietnam and inspired by Ralph Nader, he started NORML to fight marijuana criminalization. And I said, yeah, Keith's still on the team. He's our legal counsel now. He answers the phone all day long and talks to people about, their problems, if they got a charge or whatever. And this member of Congress said, when I was in college, he came to my school and I went to the airport to go pick him up. And, for me, and that opened the door, right? So like now we have a really strong foundation to have a conversation moving forward. I know that there's an openness to be had there. And now that member of Congress supports ending prohibition when they had it publicly, when they hadn't at the time. And I think, I love that story so much because it really highlights how, one innocuous thing that happened 30 years ago, an activist who flew out to a state and got picked up to go speak at a college, now rippled through that it convinced a member of Congress to come out publicly and support a position that is contrary to the majority of his colleagues in the caucus.
Wow. These are both amazing stories.
But
that's crazy.
But let me tell you another story, because
please.
You brought up, you at the top, you said, oh, well, marijuana is now regarded as kind of an innocuous substance. And we all kind of now recognize the data that's clearly borne out in the data. And there's 36,000 peer-reviewed studies on pubmed.gov that back this up. That it's objectively less harmful than alcohol or tobacco or McDonald's, which are all regulated substances here in America. But the foundation of how we got to here is so important. And as with so many other aspects of American public policy, the implementation of what we now have as the entrenched status quo wasn't because of science, wasn't because of evidence. It was anecdotal, later proven false stories to maintain structural supremacy and white supremacy. In 1937, a gentleman named Harry Anslinger, who at the time was the head of the Federal Division of Narcotics, before that, he was a prohibition agent against alcohol. Alcohol prohibition ended. He was a bum without a job, and he convinced Congress to set up this national narcotics division. And then he would say things along the lines of, reefer makes the darkies think that they're as good as white men. And that is the intellectual foundation of how we got to this current status quo of marijuana being criminalized and its enforcement overwhelmingly taken out against particularly young Black and brown men. And it's such a schism that we're in right now, where culturally a supermajority of Americans support ending prohibition and legalizing and regulating the substance, and yet, on average, annually over the last 5 years, over 600,000 Americans were put into handcuffs.
Still, yep. 600,000. So we have a question from Facebook. Didn't the ex-Republican Speaker of the House go into cannabis business? Actually, what is going on with John Boehner? Do you know?
He did. John Boehner is now on the board of a company called Acreage Holdings, which is a MSO, or a multi-state operator that holds licenses in a number of states. So he is currently profiting off of the distribution of, as many of my members would say, very overpriced medical cannabis. And he has been, to the degree that he's been active or effective, we've still yet to see. But yeah, no, John Boehner, as the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, is now a member of the board of directors of a cannabis company.
Well, so you may have been about to go in this direction, but I'm just going to ask anyway. So from A to B, right, where we're criminalizing the substance because primarily people of color are using it, to now where a white Republican is investing in it. Mm-hmm. Obviously it's good that more people are recognizing that marijuana is not something that should be putting people behind bars. But of course, lots of people are saying with complete justice that this is itself racism. So when white people do this, it's fine and they get to make a smart investment. And yet Black and brown people are still thrown in jail for this. Like, what does that evolution look like?
Well, I want to call you in out of a place of love at first and correct and make sure we set the record straight. Across racial lines, through all the data that we have and all the polling that we have, Black and white Americans consume cannabis at about the same rate, right? And throughout America, depending on which poll you're looking at, about 12 to 14% of Americans consume. The biggest deviation of a population density is actually veterans. Veterans consume cannabis at according to the American Legion, 22%. And they said that they're specifically doing to alleviate symptoms of a physical or a mental ailment. But that's a whole different subject, and we can talk about that in a second. But no, it's the racial disparity here is an enforcement of criminalization against American citizens. So the use of the suspicion of possession is overwhelmingly a cause of action for an interaction with law enforcement and people of color, right? I've experienced this very much firsthand in my own life. When I was 18 years old, I got arrested with my best friend. We went through the system. I got 40 hours of community service and court costs. He got a $500 fine, a year of probation. He had to go to drug and alcoholics courses. He had to get drug tested, and he had to pay for all those things. And exact same charges, exact same judge, exact same day in court. If anything, he looked better than I did when we walked into that courtroom. I was a little bit of a smartass at the time, and he was much more apologetic. And that's the disparity that we see. But I just wanted to clear that up. Yeah, we all smoke pot at about the same rates, right?
Well, right. I mean, I don't think anyone who's ever been to a college campus would debate that.
But I think that when we talk about what is justice look like in this space, I don't like to think that I have a monopoly on that definition. So there, from my role at NORML, we focus on the consumer implications for cannabis policy reform and how it relates to the state and how it relates to other, just kind of like the cultural norms, right? So we take less of a position on ownership. We don't fancy ourselves that, none of the people at NORML are necessarily planning on going to sell, professionally sell weed. We do policy. And a lot of it is about how we reduce negative implications for people who consume it. So that's ending outright criminalization. So that way we don't see our fellow Americans being put in handcuffs or harassed by law enforcement. That's ending drug testing policies. So that way we don't see, and this is both a racial and a class division issue where, you don't see CEOs getting tested for marijuana, but you see minimum wage workers getting tested. And that is something that there is no solid evidence to justify that metabolic elements in your system mean that you're impaired, but you'll still lose your job. So, that's another aspect of it. There's DUID policy for driving under the influence of drugs. Again, that's another drug testing issue. Still in 16 states, you could automatically lose your driver's license if you're found with possession of marijuana, even if it's not in the car. And a laundry list of other aspects of public policy where, because someone chooses to do something in their personal time that is by every metric less harmful than drinking alcohol, they are vilified and otherized and oppressed by the state and public institutions.
Well, so let's get into some of that legislation. Tell me about the MORE Act.
The MORE Act. So the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act, or the MORE Act, we love our acronyms in Washington, D.C., is historic legislation. It became, last December, in the previous session of Congress, the first bill which would end marijuana's federal prohibition to ever be considered in Congress and pass a chamber of the institution. It passed on a bipartisan vote. It was largely along party lines, but we did see 6 elected Republicans vote in favor of it when it passed. And what that, in addition to ending prohibition, it would have multiple components that would incentivize states and localities to expunge criminal records. Because one thing we got to keep in mind, so I'm going to get wonky for 1 second, is that the overwhelming majority of criminal records that have been assigned to Americans have not been by federal agents, but it's been by your local or state police officers. So that we can't have the federal government mandate that they keep those records or they expunge those records. We can only incentivize them to do so. So they have incentive programs in there that will empower advocates around the country to be able to go and lobby their state houses and their city councils to apply for that money, so that way they can, at no cost to the individuals, expunge those records. And then it also has other aspects of civil protections and statutory protections for marijuana consumers, such as prohibiting the denial of public benefits because of a drug test. I'm sure you're well aware of efforts all around the country to drug test recipients of public benefits. That's a travesty. In no way, shape, or form should we have the government policing what we put in our bodies. And protections for immigrants. One of the leading causes for deportations, and certainly the leading cause amongst drug offenses for deportations, is simple marijuana possession. So we want to end that practice of the state being able to deny the pathway to the American dream simply because someone wants to smoke a joint, just as Abraham Lincoln did, and really move forward on that. So. Wait,
hold on. You're saying a lot of smart things, but I just want to clarify. Was Abe Lincoln a stoner? Do you have intel? I don't.
He is quoted as saying that I'm going to botch the quote, forgive me, but it's something along the lines of one of his favorite things to do is sit on his porch with a pipe of sweet hemp.
And, no way.
I mean, hey, he was a farmer, and when you're farming and you're doing that hard work, whatever you want to do to pass the time and relax and reduce the inflammation of your muscles, which cannabis has been found to be a great anti-inflammatory. For whatever choices you choose to consume, hey, whatever. I'm not gonna hold the 16th president in ill repute because he liked to smoke pot. I mean, George Washington grew cannabis on his farm
How are you just mentioning this? I didn't know either of these things.
Well, now you know. Okay. This is why we do this.
It's true.
So the MORE Act, it was truly a monumental moment. It's unfortunate that the House of Representatives didn't take up the bill until December after the election, which denied the American public the ability to know where their representative stood before they went to the ballot box. So right now, the bill's been reintroduced in the House of Representatives this year. It hasn't been reintroduced yet in the Senate for a really interesting reason, which is its former Senate sponsor is no longer in the Senate. They're now the vice president of the United States. It was
I think I've heard of that person. Yeah.
It was then Senator, now Vice President Kamala Harris, who carried the bill. And, unfortunately, she has not spoken about the need to end marijuana criminalization since assuming the vice presidency. And unfortunately, the Biden administration's official position, as multiple times articulated by the press secretary, is that they do not support ending marijuana prohibition. They do not support ending the criminalization. They say that they support descheduling, but they also say they support Schedule 2, which is the same level of criminalization as cocaine. So I don't know if I don't know if you think that cocaine is decriminalized, but
I mean, I'm fine with cocaine being decriminalized also, but I think we should definitely start with weed.
Yeah, I mean, it says marijuana on my door, not cocaine. So I don't want to otherize the substance, but I'm only going to talk about marijuana. But no, I mean, absolutely. I think a lot of the same principles apply when it talks to what's the role of the state to oppress people for what they put into their bodies. for what's commonly just referred to as a victimless crime.
Well, and it's, I mean, with weed specifically, you're right. It is very distinct from any other kind of substance, because marijuana is such it's socially ubiquitous. It's on college campuses, it's in neighborhoods, it's in communities, because it is a harmless, chill substance that has very few ultra negative side effects unless you're doing it in extreme quantities. And it's starting to feel like, shocker, maybe that's why they picked it to criminalize, because it is so ubiquitous. Unlike cocaine, which I'm pretty sure doesn't have a place at a social family function. Maybe, I don't know. But
maybe some families, but
maybe some families.
I wouldn't say that marijuana is entirely harmless. It is a mood altering and mind altering substance. There are people who experience very negative reactions when they consume it, predominantly paranoia. But they're short lived, right?
Okay, let me say this differently. It's less harmful than alcohol, which is everywhere.
Yes. And yet so celebrated. And this is one of those challenges that our organization is in right now, because at the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, our focus is making sure that people who choose to consume cannabis are not going to face state violence. But we now enter this emerging industry, and their incentive structure is very different than what our incentive structure is. Their incentive structure is to sell more cannabis. And, I think that we're going to see, we're seeing this play out in the states that are experimenting with legalization now, restrictions on advertising. We saw when Canada legalized marijuana, because our neighbors to the north are very forward-thinking people. They prohibited advertising. They prohibited the use of celebrity endorsement. They prohibited a lot of different types of claims to be able to be made by cannabis companies. So it's kind of relatively innocuous, right? You're not going to go to a hockey game or a curling match or whatever they call the curling events up there, and see big marijuana advertisements plastering the stadiums. So I think it's something that, is definitely an ongoing conversation here, what the future of those kind of regulations are going to look like. But from my personal belief, I don't care whether or not anybody ever chooses to smoke marijuana again in the future, right? I'm totally content if everyone stopped tomorrow. I could quit my job. The use of my job would no longer be needed. But after 80 years of marijuana's criminalization, we still see 1 in 7 Americans on a semi-regular basis choosing to consume. And as long as they make that choice, they shouldn't fear the state. They shouldn't live in a constant, they already smoke pot. Sometimes some of them are paranoid enough. We shouldn't be having law enforcement waste their time and infringe on our civil liberties because they choose to do that.
Well, so I feel like I cut you off at a certain point. With the MORE Act, what's the path forward, and what should people be doing to organize around it?
That's an excellent question. And here with act.tv, it's always about action. So with the MORE Act, it passed last December, but the session of Congress ended, so we had to restart. So we're calling, the bill has been reintroduced. Right now, we just added 47 new congressional co-sponsors last week. So we're now up to 53. It's being led by Chairman Nadler of the Judiciary. We need to get more co-sponsors. We really need to get loud. I know through NORML at least, I think we broke 100,000 messages have been sent to Congress. We're not big fans of petitions here. Petitions don't change lawmakers' minds. Democracy is a verb, and we need people to contact their representatives and make it unambiguously clear that, now we're kind of culturally in this moment where everybody sees the writing on the wall, everybody sees that we're going to legalize, but every single day that goes by, more and more Americans, overwhelmingly young, poor Black men, are put into handcuffs, and we need action now. So we're calling on people to contact their lawmakers and demand that the MORE Act be considered again and passed through the House to really put pressure on the Senate. And things are very different in the Senate now. On February 1st, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, along with Senators Ron Wyden and Cory Booker, announced that the three of them are working together on their own new marijuana bill that would get into some of the kind of post-prohibition regulatory structures that were not included in the MORE Act. So they committed to include the really, really important criminal justice provisions and those kind of reforms that have gotten us to this cultural touchstone where everybody agrees marijuana shouldn't be criminalized. And they're trying to address, okay, well, what kind of labeling standards do we need to have? What kind of, just as on alcohol, with every bottle of beer, it's clearly labeled, X% alcohol. And if we want to have this substance be responsibly consumed, we need to make sure we have informed consumers.
Well, right. And it's I've had this conversation with a couple people who are sort of coming around on this issue, and what they seem to land on is, well, I don't know if people should be doing drugs. And it's, as you said, Justin, it's not really about whether or not people should be doing it. It's about whether or not the government has the right to intervene in a violent and predictably racially motivated way to hurt people. I mean, there are lots of things that we probably shouldn't do that aren't great for us, that are legal. Tons.
Yeah. Driving cars. It's not great for the planet. We do it millions and millions of people, billions of people do it every day.
I just found out that taking airplanes isn't good for you. Who knew? Did you know that?
Shocking.
Yeah. I didn't know that. Okay, so what is the future of the other? Wait, so what's the difference between the two bills? The Schumer bill and the MORE Act. What is the difference?
Schumer bill, we don't have yet. They have been, and their offices have been incredibly receptive to all of our input as far as what should be in the bill, but we haven't seen the bill text yet, and we've been politely chiding them because they keep on using the word soon, and as I have now multiple times sent their offices, there is no legal definition of the word soon, and we need that bill out as soon as possible because the public deserves the opportunity to have their senators on record where they stand. Do you stand on the side of oppression and prohibition, or do you stand on the side of civil liberties and legalization?
Well, that brings us to a comment from the comments. I'm interested in the idea of marijuana sent as an excuse for cops to do whatever they want by saying they smelled it. And it is interesting, right? Like, okay, so now that there are drugs and, do you guys feel like that's true at NORML? Like, do you think that it seems like pot is a gateway drug? It's a gateway drug to police violence, like.
Not the language I would use. But no, this is an incredibly important aspect of the policy that often goes unmentioned because it does kind of get so, for lack of a better term, in the weeds. But we're
both so punny today.
It's just like all the puns, they just grow out of the ground, like a weed, if you will. That we need to take away the ability for law enforcement and to be able to use, especially in legal jurisdictions, to use that as an actionable cause for a search. So, in my I used to work in the Virginia State Senate, and that's actually how I really opened my eyes to the intersections of marijuana's criminalization that leads to mass incarceration and its contributions to it. And I'm really proud to say that in the Commonwealth and in many of the states that have reformed their policies, we have successfully gotten into law that police cannot use the odor of cannabis to justify the search of a vehicle.
I didn't know that.
There's a lot of great data from our friends over at the Marshall Project that actually saw in Colorado and Washington post-legalization, we saw a decline in the overall number of traffic stops that resulted in searches, and a tightening, not an elimination, but a tightening of the racial disparity of who was stopped and who was searched. So it's definitely, as marijuana has been one of the most commonly wielded tools of oppression in law enforcement's toolbox of interactions with citizens, we need to make sure that we're respecting that. Another component that's kind of along similar lines is home cultivation. Right now in every state in the United States, most recently with Alabama in 2016, you're legally allowed to brew or brew your own beer as long as you're not selling it, right? That's where it would go from legal to illegal. A lot of people who choose to consume cannabis want to be able to grow their own. And unfortunately, not every state that has legalized cannabis has chosen to allow for lawful home cultivation. And, our advocates for policy reform have a lot of different reasons why they support lawful home cultivation. For me, it boils down to one simple thing. Law enforcement should not be able to use the alleged suspicion of home cultivation to be able to enter someone's house without a warrant. That is why it's critically important that we include lawful home cultivation statutes in legalization bills. So that way, if law enforcement does credibly believe that someone is producing mass quantities of marijuana within a house and selling it into the unregulated market, then they should take a day, do some police work, use their evidence to get a judge to sign a warrant, and then be able to enter the house. But as of right now, under the status quo, even in a few legal states, and certainly in every prohibition state, even just the alleged suspicion, right, and the odor of cannabis can be, whether, because how are you going to hold a cop accountable for that? Oh, I smelled marijuana, so I entered the home because I thought that they were growing it. Like, how's that going to hold up in court? Or how are we going to be able to fight that in court, I should say. But if the enforcement officer is on the front porch and they say, I smelled the odor of marijuana, so I entered the house because I believe they were cultivating, and it was a very strong smell, so it smelled like it was more than 7 plants, and the legal limit's only 6, well, then attorneys can go into the judiciary and argue there is no way that you can discern what 7 plants would smell like compared to 6 plants, and hopefully be able to take action against the police and train the police not to infringe on people's civil liberties and to actually do their own police work and get a warrant.
I'm assuming that you at NORML, the line is people should be able to cultivate the plant at home.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. They should be able to cultivate it. They should be able to gift it if they cultivate it. Now, when it comes to, commerce, we want to make sure that consumers are able to be informed consumers. And that means having a basic standardization, reasonable, with reasonable regulation that include labeling, testing standards, and whatnot. So that way, just as, when you go into a bar, that there's a huge difference between getting a shot of Wild Turkey 151 versus regular whiskey. Cannabis consumers should be able to know the level of potency that they're acquiring.
Right. Well, and it's, it's a safety concern for everybody, right? Unregulated substances are not necessarily the safest. There are a lot of things we want to talk about. So you brought up the intersection between this fight and housing justice. Yeah. Now, what does that look like?
So, yeah, in the home cultivation component, that is about whether or not law enforcement can enter your home without a warrant. There is another component, which is whether or not an individual has the legal ability to possess cannabis in their home or consume cannabis in their home. And this is a little bit more complicated, where we really need to make sure we get the policy done in a thoughtful manner. Currently, because of federal prohibition, anyone who has any form of housing support through public housing vouchers, if they are found to have cannabis in their home, whether or not it was theirs, they would lose their ability to maintain that residence and lose the ability to be able to procure support for housing moving forward. What this does is it essentially says, hey, poor people, even if you're in a legal state, you don't get to enjoy the legal privileges in that state. And ultimately, in kind of an absurd unintended consequence, you're going to see people who live in public housing more likely to consume cannabis in public spaces. So, I know a lot of people complain about the odor of cannabis in their neighborhoods. Well, if we made sure that people were legally allowed to consume it within the privacy of their own home, or as we're starting to see jurisdictions do, setting up social consumption lounges, i.e. cannabis bars, then we can provide people, safe places where they can enjoy it responsibly and not have it out in the open, just as, most jurisdictions in this country have prohibitions for open containers for alcohol.
That is fascinating. I didn't think about it, but it makes sense. The idea that if people can't consume at home, of course they're going to consume it in public. Mm-hmm. So, okay, but it isn't just housing. My best friend is a social worker, and her constant frustration is this attempt by the state violence. I love that you use that term because that's what it is, to deny people who are in frequently insecure and or traumatized situation the basic services they need for survival because they smoked some weed. And that's crazy. And it puts caseworkers like her in a terrible situation. It's like, well, this is wrong. And also, this is an entirely different rabbit hole. And I promise I won't take us down it entirely. But I just want to point something out. People who are using any kind of substance in an extreme way, whether it's weed or another drug or alcohol, it's often a way to self-medicate trauma, which you're more likely to have if you're living poor in America. And so that's a multi-layered tragedy to me. A lot of people are intelligently using weed or booze because therapy and other maybe better ways of handling their stress aren't available. Not implying that everyone who smokes weed is traumatized, but I'm just saying extreme use of any substance is usually a response to trauma. And so now people who are already in terrible situations, their attempt to self-medicate is being used to make them even more traumatized. I mean, what are the other services that people can lose if they smoke weed?
So, You had this great bit about trauma, then you kind of get me with the curveball with the direct question. So I want to address.
No, go back to the rabbit. Was it too deep of a rabbit hole? Can we go down there?
No, I think a week ago we saw a supposed to be Olympic champion Sha'Carri Richardson prevented and suspended from participating in Tokyo and for representing Team USA. This woman was the fastest woman in America. And she consumed cannabis. And now she's not able to represent our country in the Olympics because of their anti-drug policies. Right now, I think we can all agree that cannabis is not a performance-enhancing drug. I don't want to dwell too much on this because I can only imagine how much of a traumatic experience this all has been for her. But as she had said, she consumed cannabis as she was dealing with the trauma of the loss of her mother. And, so this only compounds that for whatever reason that you choose to consume, if and when the state, or in this case, other public entities that are using oppressive tactics, it only compounds the trauma that is human existence in general, right? Like being human means to have some trauma in your life, and people are always going to look for ways to escapist ways. And just as people who might be in a very good mood choose to consume things like alcohol or cannabis to enhance. So we've been talking for the last week about, every single media outlet has written multiple stories about Sha'Carri Richardson, but there are millions and millions of Americans who are regularly demanded that they pee in a cup. And if that urine has trace elements of THC because they maybe smoked a joint on the weekend, that they'll lose that they would lose their job. And if you lose your job, that means you lose your ability to maintain housing. It means you lose your ability to have medical insurance. It means you lose your ability to be a productive member in the society that we are constantly trying to make better. And it is just it really compounds the criminalization of poverty that we see in nearly every aspect of our modern society. And, you know, as my grandfather said to me when I was younger, you know, it's expensive to be poor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that I can't believe we haven't talked about her yet. Also, didn't she smoke in Washington State where it's legal?
Oregon, yes.
Oregon, yeah.
Yep. Yep. But because, you know, earlier this year, we saw the Biden administration choose to deny employment, rescind employment offers, and fire people for their admissions of cannabis consumption. So whether it's you can't represent the United States as the fastest woman in America in the Olympics, whether you can be an incredibly intelligent and passionate patriot who wants to engage in public service, whether or not you want to be, you know, we just saw Amazon, the nation's second largest private employer in the country, end drug testing for marijuana for every aspect of employment that they're legally allowed to do so. They're not allowed to stop testing for the drivers because that's regulated because of a federal policy. But, you know, we are hurting people up and down the socioeconomic and cultural relevance spectrum, but we only hear the stories and often see the media articles about those who are in some kind of position of influence or prominence. And it's millions and millions of people. 1 in 7 Americans semi-regularly consume cannabis, and so often the poorest among us who are the ones who are living in the most fear.
Well, do you know the numbers for who have smoked marijuana or consumed cannabis in any way? Because they've got to be like...
We're about 50%.
Okay, all right. Well, that's lower than I expected, but yeah, that's still incredibly high. Mm-hmm. Well, and I think we went back to the staffers who were... We're here all night, folks. So the Biden staffers was especially tragic because a lot of those staffers were not, I mean, they're staffers about to work in the White House. So you can already assume a certain type of person. These are not people who were regularly smoking pot. They were people who were like, yes, at college once many years ago, I did in fact try marijuana, thinking that they should be honest. And they lost what was the opportunity of a lifetime for this. That's devastating to think about. So you touched on the fact that Biden is not great on this. Do you have insight on why or how that happened? Because wasn't he going to redeem himself for the criminal justice reforms of his Senate career? Wasn't that what I heard?
So, President Biden has been one of the architects of public policy that has dramatically increased the number of Americans who are arrested for mere cannabis possession. Period. You know, and that he is the former chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He is the proud, or at the time, the proud author of the 94 crime bill that incentivized a draconian increase in arrests and prosecutions for marijuana related infractions. Full disclosure, I actually was a staffer on the Obama Biden campaign in 2008. So I should, I guess, disclose that. But, you know, I think with the president, similarly to just the lived human experience, it is very difficult to comfortably acknowledge that you were so egregiously wrong that led to the destruction of so many lives. And what's particularly infuriating right now about the Biden administration is they use this line, and the president has used it. The press secretary has articulated it a number of times. Every single time she's asked about it, They say, we support decriminalization and rescheduling to Schedule 2. That's the official policy of this position, of this administration. That policy is inherently in conflict with itself when, as we talked about earlier, in no legal way, shape, or form can we say Schedule 2 is a decriminalized status. Schedule 2 means if you are a person who is in possession of a substance without a physician's prescription, then it is a crime. And here we have the administration being disingenuous at best. At best, they are being disingenuous about this position when there's no political benefit for them maintaining this oppressive policy of prohibition. They're almost uniformly amongst Democratic voters, their support for legalization. Supermajority, depending on the polling, between 66 and 72% of independent voters support marijuana legalization. And depending on the polling you're looking at, and I'm not talking about, stuff that we've commissioned. I'm talking about Pew, Gallup. You see in either plurality or an outright majority of Republican voters supporting the outright legalization and regulation of marijuana. So if Joe Biden, as president of the United States, continues to espouse his desire to move the country forward in a bipartisan way, cannabis is cannabis embracing reform would be one of the lowest hanging fruits that he could do so, that could reap political benefits for generations to come, given that it is such an accessible political issue, right? When you talk about marijuana policy, no matter how sophisticated of a voter you're talking to, they can understand the difference between legal and illegal, and there's not a whole lot of minutia there as we see in other aspects of policy like immigration or infrastructure, right? Like, this is a really cut and dry issue. Do you support freedom, liberties, and civil liberties and legalization, or do you support structural oppression, racial oppression, and prohibition?
Well,
and no one supports prohibition still to this day.
God, we only have 10 minutes left, which sucks because I have a million more questions.
But I want to touch on one thing that you said in the lead up to that question when we were talking about the public policy professionals that the administration denied the opportunity to serve the American public because they smoke weed. I don't care whether or not someone in a public position consumes cannabis. This week alone, I have gone out 3 different times and had an alcoholic beverage. I was able to get up in the morning and do my job. And the question shouldn't be about when they chose to consume. It's, are you able to carry out the functions for the role that you would be assuming? And as long as the answer is yes, then what you do in your off the clock hours should not be considered a factor. When in no way, shape, or form the consumption of cannabis would have any other reflection on whether or not you're able to do your job.
Well, and I think that is something, I don't know if I've said it on here yet, but America's very dichotomized relationship with marijuana and alcohol is something that I think we should all be investigating in ourselves, because America is a terrible place to be an alcoholic. We also have egregiously high numbers of alcoholism compared to the rest of the world, because every social event you go to, it's like, we're drinking because it's the 4th of July. We're drinking because it's a Tuesday. We're drinking because it's Thirsty Thursday. And we're fine with that. It's baked into almost all facets of our culture. I suppose they're like religious sects. That's not true. But so we're fine with that. It's like a joke, like, oh, hey, bro, I'm so hungover. So you're right, Justin. I mean, people seem to understand that you can have a couple beers or martinis or whatever and get up at 7 a.m. and do your job. But the fact that you've engaged in any kind of cannabis use at any point, now you're an illegal drug user, like that's something that I can't wrap my head around.
Yeah, there's a Politico reporter named Natalie Fertig who was on the Hill a couple weeks ago and went up and interviewed the junior senator from Vermont, who is a wonderful supporter and proponent of marijuana prohibition. Bernie Sanders. And
I've heard of him. I've heard wonderful things.
He's a great supporter of marijuana policy reform, amongst other things. But I'm here to talk about marijuana. So he and she was recording the interaction. She went up to him. She said, "I'm the cannabis reporter for Politico," and he joked, saying, "Are you stoned right now?" And I hearing the audio, I knew he was making a joke. But even, I remember seeing the fallout of it, and it kind of fell out into two camps, right? Like, and one of whom was a lot of people who were like, that's so offensive that he would assume that because she covers cannabis professionally for Politico, that she's stoned right now. And I've been in that position, and I don't choose to consume cannabis before I work, right? At work functions, people will offer me some, and I'll say no thanks because I'm in work mode, right? And I personally don't work well while intoxicated by cannabis, just as I don't work well sloppy drunk. And I think that, as you said, it's culturally baked in for alcohol. I thought that was, again, another wonderful pun, Jocelyn. Wonderful pun. That, what we really need to do is we need to be able to identify, like, we need to allow the opportunity for the people who choose to consume cannabis for whatever reason, that they can be informed consumers by having them have the ability to access marijuana that they know what it is, they know where it's from, they know the potency level, so that we can all figure out what our preferred consumption methods are. I know that I don't like to drink tequila. I know I like to drink whiskey. Why do I know that? Because I'm able to make the choices as a consumer that often people in the unregulated marijuana marketplace just don't have.
That's actually a very interesting point, because it's sort of a cultural trope that people who know a lot about weed are like goofy hipsters. But there's nothing goofy about knowing the difference between tequila and whiskey. That's like an important preference. Oh, yeah. They are different. Wow. We really, you're going to have to come back. Will you come back?
Absolutely.
We could do a whiskey solidarity live to prove that being intoxicated is not a great idea, but you can still have great conversations.
Whiskey and weed solidarity live.
Yes. What could go wrong? I'm sure my colleagues will love it. But so I know I'm conscious of the fact that we only have 5 minutes left, and literally every single thing we've touched on, we could go deeper into. I really want to focus though. So what are you guys doing right now? And it sounds like people should be contacting their Congress members about the MORE Act, the hypothetical Schumer-Wyden bill.
Yes.
So all right, you say this. I'm not paraphrasing.
We made it, and I like using congressing as a verb. So we'll use that we should be doing
Congress.
Your friends at NORML, for all of you viewers, made it really, really easy for you to contact Congress. We have at norml.org/act, or just go to norml.org and click the Take Action section. We make it super simple. Here's how you send a letter to your member of the House of Representatives on the MORE Act. Send a letter to your senators telling them to work with this Senate Majority Leader Schumer and Cory Booker and Ron Wyden on the Senate bill. We also have, real quick, there's the Appropriation Package currently moving through the House of Representatives. Next week is the CJS package, and we have been diligently lobbying, trying to expand an existing language. Right now, the Department of Justice is currently prohibited from using our taxpayer dollars as resources to enforce federal prohibition against medical marijuana regulators, businesses, and patients. We're trying to expand, and that's what's created the space to allow a level of comfort for even very conservative legislatures to pass medical marijuana programs. And now we're at 36 states that have medical marijuana laws. A lot of them cite that protection as the reason why they felt comfortable doing so. So we're trying to expand that language to restrict the Department of Justice from using any of our taxpayer dollars taking action against any of the legal programs as well. Because one thing I like to point out, every single owner of a licensed marijuana company that is state legal in the eyes of the federal law is analogous to a heroin kingpin who could be charged with RICO suits. And the only reason they're not is sheer political inertia. So there's the Appropriation Package. That's super important. I've had multiple governor's office use that as a justification for why they're not supporting legalization right now. So there's a lot going on, and we track state policy too. A lot of state legislatures have already closed. We've either contributed to crafting or just tracked and promoted over 500 pieces of legislation that were introduced in state houses around the country. So when we make it really easy for you to contact your state reps about those things too. So I would encourage folks to go to NORML.org. And honestly, just do congressing in general, be it for marijuana policy or anything else people are passionate about. Because a representative democracy is supposed to be representative, and it's supposed to be democratic, and democratic means take action.
I have nothing to add. That was really good, Justin. That was a really good closeout.
I'm planning on turning pro one day. What do you think?
Oh, wow. I watch your career with great interest, sir. Yeah. So I assume you guys can tell why I love Justin so much. And I hope that you're all very galvanized to get involved because, as he has said far more eloquently than I mean, this is just an issue that intersects literally everything. Housing justice, food justice, class, race, gender, there's
healthcare.
all of what?
Oh, healthcare.
Healthcare. Oh yeah, of course, healthcare.
Mental health. Fun quick story about the intersection, because I really liked your intro video. I do think you should have some kind of pieces about the suffragette movement. I think that was absent, but that's neither here nor there. But I saw you guys had the Stonewall stuff, right?
Yes. And
one thing that I did not know before I worked here is that the first medical marijuana bill ever passed in America was in 1996 in California. And it's because marijuana advocates teamed up with gay rights advocates, because it was at the time when the AIDS epidemic was absolutely brimming. And so many patients who had AIDS were using cannabis for therapeutic purposes, and they were doing so illegally. And in California, the gay rights movement and the cannabis movement combined forces and pushed forward to legalize medical marijuana, which set us on this trajectory. Here we are today with now 36 states having legal medical marijuana programs, 18 states having adult use programs. And it was because of that kind of an intersectional alliance that helped move us forward.
Well, I didn't know that, and that's wonderful. But to channel Alex Lawson, who is not with us today, not because he's dead, he's just busy.
He's staying somewhere.
But we always, Justin, as I'm sure you can tell by our title, Solidarity Live, we do like to talk a lot on this morning show about how these movements can't exist in silos. It's not like, oh, the racial justice thing, the climate justice thing. All of these issues have to come together, and we have to stand together and have a multifaceted understanding of the fact that all of this stuff is ultimately about how a very small minority of people take their power by oppressing the rest of us. And yeah, I mean, thank you so much for being here and laying out so beautifully how marijuana, which I think to the untrained eye can seem like a frivolous issue, is actually incredibly serious. And it's not about like, haha, getting high. It ruins lives. Yeah. To be clear, the criminalization ruins lives, not the substance itself. If you're comfortable having a beer with your comrades, then you should be okay with people smoking weed if they want to.
Well, with marijuana as a substance has never killed, to our knowledge, a single human being. But I can rattle off a list of names right now of people who've been murdered by the state in some way, shape, or form connected to criminalization. Breonna Taylor is one. Philando Castile is one. And so many others who. Philando Castile was murdered by the state and shot in the chest in his car in Minnesota because the officer in court testified that the odor of burnt marijuana and the fact that there was a child in the car led him to be afraid for his own life.
That's just disgusting to me.
Yeah. They shot him in the chest.
Yeah.
So, this is a really important issue. I thank you so much for letting us talk for an hour about all of the intersections. And yeah, no, we'll do it again sometime soon.
Please, honestly, this has been wonderful. And everybody go to NORML, get involved, and get involved in general in all the ways, because this is an issue that leads to people dead and ruined for no reason whatsoever. Thank you so much for being with us this morning, you guys. We'll see you later.
Thank y'all.